Today, we will hear a review of Doing Justice, a prosecutor's thoughts on crime, punishment, and the rule of law by Preet, Bharara. Our presenter is Donald Thompson. For over 30 years, Donald Thompson has been a criminal defense attorney representing the criminally accused in trial, appellate, and post-appellate cases, including capital representation before all levels of state and federal courts. In addition, Mr. Thompson has worked with the Innocence Project to secure the release of persons who have been wrongfully convicted. Since 2008, he has been the managing partner of Easton, Thompson, Kasperek, Shiffrin, LLP, the only law firm in Rochester devoted exclusively to criminal defense. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thank you very much for having me. A special thank you to Sandy Shapiro, who roped me into this engagement in the first place. I really appreciate it, Sandy. I will try to adjust a little bit because I began picking a jury in a felony criminal matter this morning. So I'm a little keyed up. I'm going to try to tone down my presentation if I can, but I'm a lawyer, so we talk fast by nature. I'll try to slow things down. So what else does that mean? It means that during the 2 weeks when I should have been preparing for this presentation, I was preparing for that trial. So I'm going to try to keep things in a linear fashion too. Hopefully I'll be able to do that. So as you heard, these presentations are on YouTube. I watched a few of them in preparation. So if you find yourself thinking, is he ever going to get to the point? You can always sneak out the back and watch YouTube, answer that question for yourself with a glass of wine, maybe some popcorn. I noticed in watching the YouTube presentations that some people don't talk very much about the book, actually. I'm going to try to talk about the book. I'll do what I can. Don't worry if you haven't read the book. There's no spoiler alerts because there are really no spoilers here. The other thing I notice is that people sometimes meander all about the stage, and I won't do that either because in federal court we're trained that we have to stand behind the podium and use the microphone. So I've been housebroken, and I'm going to stay right here. So I will give you my review of this book, but the caveat, I guess, is it's filtered through the prism of my experience. As you heard, I've got more than 30 years as a criminal defense attorney. I've never been a prosecutor. I've defended people in death penalty cases all the way down to vehicle and traffic offenses. Sir, do you know why I stopped you? Officer, only you know why you stopped me. So my views are those of someone who swims in this pool. So what bothers me here about this book, to paraphrase Frank Sinatra, complaints, I have a few. It might not bother you. It's why I don't watch cop shows or courtroom drama shows, or really my wife won't let me because I wind up yelling at the TV. You can't do that. It's a different, but from a different perspective, from her perspective, she's not an attorney. It's engaging entertainment, which is sort of how I view this book. So the things that turn me off might have no effect on you whatsoever. So on with it then. So Preet Bharara, who is he? Well, he's a graduate of Columbia Law School. He was the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York from 2009 up to 2017. Now we have 4 districts in New York. We're in the Western District, which is basically everything from Syracuse west all the way down to the Pennsylvania line. The Southern District is based in Manhattan. So he was the head attorney in the Southern District of New York, and at first was asked to remain in that position by Donald Trump after he was elected. After that, someone thought the better of it and asked for all of the resignations of the Obama-appointed U.S. attorneys, and everybody gave one except for Mr. Bharara, who refused. He was promptly fired after that. So that helped his own star rise some. He's done very well since then. He has a podcast called Stay Tuned with Preet. It's very engaging. Talks about social and legal justice issues. It's rated 4.9 on Apple Podcasts. He's a regular CNN commentator. You know, who could decipher the news without Preet Bharara's commentary? He makes it simple and easy. One of the criticisms that we had discussed earlier is he too talks kind of fast. He doesn't take a lot of time to pause, but he's very conversational as both a writer and as a speaker. So he has the chops to write an engaging book, and he's written one. This is not a dry legal textbook by any means. It's very much like his podcast. If you ever have a chance, you might want to listen to that. He's helped some by his subject matter. Who doesn't like crime shows other than me, right? Everybody likes crime. CSI, all 12 versions of Law and Order, right? Hill Street Blues for those of us who are a little more mature. Because they're good stories. They present the human condition laid bare, which is sort of what he attempts to do as well in this book, and quite effectively. You know, we want to hear stories that are true, whether they actually ever happened or not. So the Southern District of New York U.S. Attorney's Office is great fodder for those kinds of stories. They have prosecuted during his tenure some of the highest profile cases of the high profile cases. More mobsters than you can shake a stick at, including Sheldon Silver, Speaker of the New York State Assembly, and Dean Skelos, the New York State Senate Majority Leader, prosecuted just months apart, by the way. That was a hell of a run for the Southern District U.S. Attorney's Office. The Times Square bomber, you know, the NYPD cannibal cop. There's plenty of juicy cases to dish on here. And he's a good storyteller. These are good stories. But I suggest to you that's just what they are. They're stories. I'm not saying that they're intentionally false, but I'm saying that his descriptions aren't all completely true. So what are Preet Bharara's thoughts on crime? Well, the book's broken up into 4 sections relating to the 4 different kind of phases of prosecution: inquiry, accusation, judgment, and punishment. You know, if I'm doing my job, we never get to punishment. But he views it as you know, one of the other phases of prosecution that's difficult and troubling for prosecutors. So he breaks it down into each stage and gives his views relative to each. Basically, I would characterize the book as a memoir of his time in the Southern District of New York U.S. Attorney's Office, with some moral lessons, sort of William Bennett-like, with some war stories, because we all tell those if we're trial attorneys, and with some hindsight thrown in. He terms it to be, in 1 or 2 segments, a guide for young prosecutors, and perhaps for other people who are attempting to apply justice in their everyday lives. And it's not a bad guide in that regard. I don't have any criticism of that. He also includes some explanations or justifications or responses to criticisms that he received for choices that he made while he was in office. He held a very high-profile position, and he drew, you know, he was a lightning rod for criticism in some respects. And I think, you think, well, why does anybody ever write a book? Well, one of the reasons to write a book might be, to have the podium for a bit, to provide the explanations that you could not provide at the time to the criticisms that were leveled at you, and he's done that here. Not in an offensive way at all, but he takes this opportunity to explain himself with respect to some of these. We'll talk about a couple of them. One of my complaints is the picture that he draws of the Southern District of New York U.S. Attorney's Office and his colleagues in that office. Now, to be fair, they are a very accomplished office. They can draw from the best of the best as far as the law school graduates go. They can draw from clerks for circuit court or Supreme Court judges. It's a very enviable position if you're a lawyer to be employed by the Southern District of New York. because it is such a high-profile office. They are viewed by some as the preeminent prosecutor's office in the nation for U.S. Attorney's offices. Mr. Bharara beats that drum several times, which is not completely unfair. But the entire picture of the office that he provides is sort of painted through rose-colored glasses. After a while, it reminded me of Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong, and the men are good-looking, and all the children are above average. No one has any faults or moral lapses in his description. He spends whole chapters lionizing some former coworkers. Others appear just for glowing cameos, and then they exit stage left. Surely many attorneys and investigators are employed there that have many admirable qualities. But come on. No one has a pimple. No one ever farts. So the other question, why write a book? Well, here, because of the extent to which he does it, part of the answer might be, to commend his former colleagues, to give them their day in the spotlight. He spends that much time naming and praising in the course of the book, and they may well be deserving of that praise, but that's not why I read the book. It becomes a little cloying after a while, and it just can't all be true. There would be no wonderfulness left over for the rest of us. So you wonder what else might not be completely true in his description. His mantra, as he expresses it, that he used with his subordinates, his co-workers, was do the right thing in the right way for the right reasons. Very laudable. And based on this book, or his description in this book, he believes they hit the bullseye every time. And he did too. And he describes wrestling with difficult or tough decisions as a result of the office. And he quotes Oliver Cromwell, "Think that you may be wrong." And he thinks it, or at least he gives lip service to it in this book. But thinking it and admitting it are two different things. And he never admits that he's wrong. And not in an offensive way, but he doesn't take that final step. And that's been my experience with U.S. attorneys and U.S. attorneys' offices, his office and other offices, is they have this unshakable belief that they are right, often despite what judges or sometimes juries tell them about that. He also describes here prosecutors having a hard job. It's a very difficult job. Come on. Their success rate is 99 point something or another, depending on the year, in their prosecutions. Wow is right. So who else among us, what pipe fitter, what librarian has a 99 point something success rate? Well, and why do they? Well, because they have all the resources of the federal government at their disposal, for one thing, but because they pick which cases they'll prosecute. They don't have to prosecute every case, and they don't. Many times there is joint jurisdiction with state authorities, and they will prosecute a case instead. Why is that? Why is that selective process at work? Because they can't easily handle being told they're wrong. They're a little snowflakey that way. I find this sensitivity or this insecurity sort of odd, because on our side, we're told we're wrong all the time, often many times a day. So if I couldn't handle that, I'd be selling real estate. So they really have a hypersensitivity to that, though, because it's all about, or a lot of it is about, frankly, the public perception. And, they're appropriately concerned about public perception because of being a government office, but sometimes too concerned for their own well-being. Mr. Bharara spends a lot of time about the decision to charge being a weighty one, that prosecutors struggle with it. It's difficult because they're aware of what kind of an impact it's going to have on somebody's life, whether they are ultimately convicted or whether they are not. In a federal case, it's almost always going to be, at least quasi-high profile. It's going to be in the newspaper. The person's name is going to be out there. So they claim to struggle with it, or he claims they struggle with this, but I don't think they struggle with it enough. Or if they do, I haven't seen evidence of it, because there are other things at play. It is a political office. So, sometimes it's the public appearances that matter. It's the press conference, it's the announcement, and that's a win at times for the U.S. Attorney's Office too. But throughout the book, Mr. Bharara expresses a humility and a moral struggle about these decisions that have to be made by someone in a position of power and authority. That struggle may have been internal while he was a U.S. attorney, but it wasn't evident at the time, nor from other U.S. attorneys. The ideals that he espouses now in this book, well, he may have felt them while in a position of authority. This book, I think, would have more credibility if it had been published then. I'm reminded of this former Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell, who years after he retired from the bench bemoaned the fact that the worst decision he ever made was the decision to reinstate the death penalty. And if he had not joined on, that decision would not have carried the day. But that was long after he retired, when his words could help no one, like Bharara's high ideals now. So there's a little vignette. It goes by kind of quickly in the book, but there's a little vignette about a gentleman who faced federal prosecution for escape from a federal facility. Why did he escape? Well, he slipped out to have sex with his wife, and he was caught actually breaking back into the facility. That's how they knew he was gone. Not until the alarm goes off while he's coming back in do they figure out that somebody's missing. So the case is presented to the federal grand jury, and uncharacteristically, the grand jury refused to indict him. The highest state court judge in this state once said that the grand jury could indict a ham sandwich if they want to. So Bharara's comment is they refused to indict this ham sandwich. And what he says in the book is, I didn't think it then, but I think it now. Good. Well, that kind of sums up the perspective in the book. What else didn't he think then that he thinks now? You have to wonder. It's easy for him to express these lofty concerns, these city on a hill kind of presentations, when he doesn't have any authority to enact them. Another somewhat complaint, you guys are just going to think, geez, all this guy does is complain. But another complaint about the description in the book, from my perspective, is he talks about how U.S. attorneys' offices work. And there are a number of descriptions where he says, well, this particular prosecutor brought this case or that case. And I knew little about it until something happened. It was called to my attention and I had to address it, or there had to be a press conference. Ladies and gentlemen, that's just not how U.S. attorneys' offices work. There are several layers of review for every decision of significance. You will hear often, if you're on my side of the fence, the Department of Justice speaks with one voice. Line attorneys are not able to go out and develop cases and just have them filed and bring them and prosecute them. A good example is capital cases, where someone faces the federal death penalty. In every case, the Attorney General makes the decision as to whether or not the federal authorities will pursue the death penalty. And we get a letter. If they choose not to, it's inartfully called a no-seek letter. It's one sentence, it's the same sentence every time, signed by the Attorney General saying we're not going to seek the death penalty. So it goes up through all of these levels. at least with respect, however, to the decisions that can be made, that are permitted under the protocols to be made by a local office. Every buck stops with the U.S. Attorney. Preet Bharara, there aren't cases going on that the U.S. Attorney doesn't know about. There's a number of chapters that deal with different aspects of prosecution in really state and federal courts, but more prevalent in federal courts. The one I spent a lot of time on is the one he captions it, snitches, cooperating witnesses, the devil you know, basically, and talks about the balancing act utilized in using snitches or cooperating witnesses in federal court to obtain convictions against other individuals who the prosecuting authority has determined that are worse than the snitches. Sometimes they're right about that, sometimes they're not. In my experience, the government in federal court has not tried, in my experience, a case without at least one cooperating witness, usually several. So how do they get people to cooperate? Well, often by the sentences that are faced. It's largely up to the U.S. attorneys, because based upon how you are charged in federal court, things like mandatory minimums can come into play. They can tie the judge's hands with respect to what a sentence might be. And it's extremely coercive. It's not waterboarding, but it works just as well, or better. I think it's actually more effective. I'll just give you one brief example. One of the sections in the U.S. Code is 924C, the unlawful possession of a gun. Up until very recently, the unlawful possession of a gun in association with another crime, such as drug dealing or something like that, required a 5-year mandatory minimum consecutive sentence to any other sentence you received. Okay, well, 5 years, that's not terrible for possession of a gun, but that's for the first gun. Gun number 2 requires a 25-year mandatory minimum consecutive sentence. So, if the authorities come into your house and they execute a search warrant and there are 2 guns there, you're looking at a 30-year sentence right off the bat without regard to any other sentence you might receive for why ever they were searching your house. So what would U.S. attorneys do? Well, a lot of times they'd charge the one gun and hold the second one back and say, well, you know, if you want to help us out, you can. If you don't, we might just supersede this indictment and we might charge you with that other gun. So, do you feel lucky, punk? So, they're given the tools to coerce cooperating witnesses into cooperating. And the problem is it's a great incentive to lie, and people will. I mean, they are not of the highest moral fiber to start with. That's not where we get our cooperating witnesses. And, you know, who will, certainly you would think, well, the government has some restrictions on who they will deal with in this regard, but they don't. I mean, you remember Sammy the Bull Gravano. He was one very famous cooperating witness, but he's not, you know, beyond the pale. There are others who are murderers. There's a particular blood gang member that Preet mentions in the book who committed over 200 robberies, all of which were forgiven because he cooperated with the government. Here in the Western District of New York, there was one particular cooperator who testified at trial on the stand that he took the money that the government gave him for cooperation, and he went to Ohio and he bought drugs and he bought guns with that. And he actually got caught bringing those guns and drugs back to New York State, but they still wouldn't throw him off the government team. So once you're on the team, it's difficult to get thrown off. So the concern or the sense of injustice that Mr. Bharara mentions does not extend to justice offended by these snitches and the deals that are extended to them. Nor does it extend to entrapment, which he talks about legitimately some in the book as being a concern. What is entrapment? Well, there's a good example given in the book of 4 individuals, at least one of them actively mentally ill, who were racists and wanted to engage in racist, violent activities, but really didn't have the wherewithal to do so, and were never going to develop the wherewithal without government help. but they got the government help. It's sad, but it's funny. At one point, the conspiracy involves these 4 co-conspirators and 6 government agents, without which things would not have moved forward. If you have another few hours you want to kill, you could listen to the podcast Bundyville. You remember Cliven Bundy and his sons, also infiltrated by government agents, and at one point had more government agents working toward a conspiracy plan to bomb this U.S. land office than actual conspirators. But all of those concerns notwithstanding, these gentlemen were charged, and they were convicted. And they were convicted of a conspiracy with a 25-year mandatory minimum sentence, because that's what the government charged them with, and the judge's hands were tied at the time of sentencing. The judge at sentencing said, Mr. Cromartie was one of the co-conspirators. He said, only the government could have made a terrorist out of Mr. Cromartie, a man whose buffoonery is positively Shakespearean. But he imposed a sentence that was required by law because he was given no choice, given the government's charging scheme. So, aside from the moral concerns or weighing, there is some time spent by Mr. Bharara explaining decisions that were made by him in the office. One of them is the cannibal cop prosecution, where there was, some people are into fantasy football. I guess some people are into fantasy cannibalism. I don't know about this segment of people, but there are online chat groups for people who want to talk about this stuff. And the question becomes, are they just talking about it? Are they just imagining it, or is it really something that's going to happen? Well, the lower court found that it was not close enough to completion to warrant a prosecution, and Mr. Bharara and his office were upset by that, and they appealed that, and the appellate court said the same thing, that there wasn't enough here beyond words to justify this prosecution. And the thing in the book that I find interesting is, even after being told by 2 different courts, you've gone a bit too far here, there's no second guessing on Mr. Bharara's part about the rightness of their position or whether they should have brought the prosecution in the first place, because his explanation is, well, look, in situations like this, you don't know, and you don't want gun-shy prosecutors. You want somebody who will bring the charge, which goes to one of the other criticisms that he responds to, the absence of any prosecution of Wall Street bankers after the mortgage fraud crisis. None of them got prosecuted. And his explanation is, well, they're difficult cases, it's complex, there's voluminous materials, and the other thing he doesn't talk about are, those guys can hire the best defense teams available, and it's a lot of work, and we might lose. And, by the way, they're all rich white guys. So there were a lot of criticisms leveled at his office for the failure to prosecute those guys. And he spends some time explaining why he elected and didn't feel that he could do so. But he spends no time really talking about the meat and potatoes of federal court prosecutions, drug conspiracies. I don't know exactly what the percentage is, but it's probably 85% or so of the federal cases that are prosecuted involve drug possession or distribution. And he doesn't mention any, they're not very sexy, so he doesn't mention any of those at all here, which gives you a little bit of a skewed idea of what actually is involved in this prosecution. He does, you've heard it before, he reiterates it that this is the best system in the world, which might be damning with faint praise. It takes good, moral, committed people to make it work, he says. It's like a 747. It's a great airplane, but it's not going to land itself. So in his narrative, though, all those good, moral, committed people are in the prosecutor's office. But, you know, we need good, moral, committed people on the other side, too, to rein in prosecutors who charge people who should not be charged or overcharge people. And I think, probably running out of time, but I have one quick other vignette from the book, which he talks about, is Brandon Mayfield, who was the Oregon attorney who was implicated in the Madrid bombing in 2004. 93 people died, 2,000 people were injured, and allegedly there was a fingerprint that matched Mr. Mayfield on the bomb materials in Madrid. The problem is Mr. Mayfield had not left the United States for over a decade, could not have been present at the bombing, but he had married a Muslim immigrant, and he had converted to Islam himself. So he got some special attention from the government and ultimately was implicated based upon a fingerprint that was of no value for comparison. But the government didn't throw up their hands and say, geez, Mr. Mayfield, we're really sorry that we made this mistake. We're not going to prosecute you. They were painted into a corner by zealous defense counsel where they couldn't go anywhere else. And then Mr. Mayfield sued for the damages that he experienced because this was nationwide news, and they fought that too. And he, you know, still no apology from the government. They wound up with, I think he wound up with a several $million verdict, which certainly is not enough. So in closing, I recommend it as an entertaining book if you're not a criminal defense attorney. And, you know, he tells good stories, and it's very engaging. It's a read that moves right along. So, thank you.